Good evening, everybody,
Good
and
evening.
welcome to our gathering this evening. The first, we hope, of many others on this theme. Our speaker this evening is Mr. David Lohan. David is from Galway, but he now lives in Cork. David has a research interest in human trafficking and modern slavery, and he has a specific interest in how African witchcraft is used to commit acts of violence against victims of trafficking. He's also the author of the book, which you'll shortly see on your screen. And we would recommend that you buy it and share it. If you have questions during the course of David's talk, please put them in the chat box and they will be dealt with at the end of the talk. So with that now, I invite David Lohan to speak to us on this very interesting topic.
Thank you very much, Sister Eilish. So this evening's webinar is entitled The Weaponisation of Cultural Beliefs in Human Trafficking, the Ensnaring Power of Witchcraft. And I just want to start by adding my welcome to those given by Sister Eilish. And I know we're joined here this evening by persons in Ireland, Africa, Canada, United States, and other parts. And I know too that we're joined by persons who are in religious life and those in secular life, by people who are working in policing, NGOs, and in other capacities. So you're all very, very welcome. Just to give you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about then this evening, the structure of our talk. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm going to say something about the work that I do. I'm going to look at why this work is important. And I'm not going to presume that you necessarily have any expertise in this area. I'm going to give a little bit of explanation as to what those areas are that we're looking at so that you can come to this and make your own decisions then on what you've heard. I'm going to outline the nature of the crime and where it happens. And then I'm going to go through a detailed fictitious example, one which I have generated, one I call Joy's story, about a young lady who has endured these rites. And then I'm going to conclude and hand over to Ejiro then at that point. So today's webinar is a collaboration between the Sisters of Our Lady of Apostles, the OLA, the Society of African Missions, SMA Fathers, and myself, David Lohan. And just a bit about myself to start. So I grew up in Galway City. I live now in outside Cork City, and I've been here for some years. My original degree is probably not what you'd expect. It's in the area of industrial engineering. And I have higher diplomas in education, applied science, and the arts. And some years ago, I did a Master's of Arts in the area of politics at University College Cork. And day to day, I work in the field of information technology in the private sector. But my research interest is very much in the area of human trafficking. And that interest comes from work that I did years ago with Cush China, which was a charity run by the SMA Fathers here in Cork. And it stems from an initial project I was asked to do, very much involving African witchcraft in human trafficking. My most recent work is a book entitled At Freedom's Crossroads, Making Sense of Modern Slavery. And the book uses the slavery of the past, particularly the slavery of the United States prior to the Civil War, and it builds a model of what slavery actually entails. And to do that, I looked at the writings of former slaves, such as the great Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Ann Jacobs, and Solomon Northrop, their works and others. I also used the work of abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who of course wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and also more objectionable sources. For example, the slaveholder Edmund Ruffin, who wrote extensively on slavery. And what I did was build a model, essentially, or a picture, an understanding of slavery, to address three questions that I thought were very worthwhile looking at. And they are, why does slavery exist? What does it mean to be a slave? And importantly, what can be done to end it? And the book itself is available from all the usual sources online, retailers. And it's also available as an ebook too. Before I start, I just want to say something about Ireland's anti-slavery tradition. I suppose most famously, St. Patrick, I suppose, would have been the first maybe mention of a slave in Ireland that we know about, the most know about, that he was brought to Ireland and enslaved. And then if you go right up to the 1840s, Frederick Douglass actually spent quite a long time here in Cork City, not very far at all from where I am talking from this evening. And one of the things Douglass mentioned in all of his talks, and he gave many of them here in Cork, he said, I would have the intelligence and humanity of the entire people of Ireland against that infamous system. And of course, that infamous system is the system of slavery. So I think we would do well just to remember, even as an Irish people, that there is a tradition in this country of standing up against slavery. The purpose of our webinar this evening is to shed light on what is a major criminal enterprise. And we can't take away from that. It is a major criminal enterprise, one that profits from the exploitation of predominantly women and girls. And we're going to describe how cultural practices are weaponized to commit this terrible crime. And most importantly, we're going to shed light on the reality of our brothers and sisters who are here in Ireland, some of them, others who are in Europe and in other parts of the world, people who are suffering as a result of this weaponization. So human trafficking, we'll just start with a little bit about human trafficking. What is human trafficking? A lot has been said about human trafficking, but I think we can reduce it to just one word. Human trafficking is slavery. And I think all of us have a good idea of what slavery itself entails. The word trafficking itself is commonly misinterpreted, particularly in the modern context, as involving some movement. And it doesn't require movement at all. In fact, trafficking, it means trade. So when we talk about human trafficking, what we're actually talking about is a trade in human beings, or otherwise making people available for exploitation. So please do bear in mind that if we talk about human trafficking, what we're really just talking about is slavery. And it probably isn't all that different to the slavery of the past. When it comes to culture, Oxford professor Edward B. Tyler in 1871, he defined culture as a complex whole, one which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, customs, and other capabilities and habits acquired by people. At first glance, it seems like a terribly complex definition. But I think really what Tyler was saying was, it's really about identity, about who people are. You know, all those elements that make up a people as a people. And we're going to be looking at one part of culture this evening. We're going to be looking at that part of belief. Now, I would remind you as well that in Ireland, we have our own cultural beliefs. We certainly have our own culture. We have beliefs as well. And we could maybe build some synergies with those abroad, in bearing in mind that we have spiritual beliefs as well that come from our culture, particularly in the fairies, which maybe doesn't translate so well abroad, but certainly in Ireland, the fairies were no laughing matter. People wouldn't interfere, for example, with ring forts. Farmers would definitely stay away from them out of fear. We also have the tradition as well of not going near the hawthorn bush and cutting that down. So sometimes you'd see the single bush standing in a field for the very same reason, that people were afraid. And all of that comes from cultural belief. So I'll let you draw breath for a moment, and I hope I'm not going too fast. So I know I'm kind of putting a lot out there. But juju is central to what we're going to talk about this evening. And juju is a belief system, and it is common to some West African countries. There's by no means is juju an oddity in these countries. Juju is a daily reality of life. In fact, juju is life. Importantly, juju is not negated by religious beliefs. So if we go back to the Irish context again, you're obviously dealing with a Christian country, but yet had belief in the fairies, and all this comes from culture. So the fact that you believe in one thing doesn't mean that you can't believe in the other. There is no apparent contradiction. Sometimes abroad, juju is known as voodoo, but that's a word that probably people in that part of the world wouldn't use, unless maybe trying to explain themselves to really people from beyond West Africa. Predominantly, it's known as juju. And juju belongs to a much broader set of practices, a family of practices which are known as African witchcraft. And there's a lot to African witchcraft, okay? So what we're looking at this evening is a subset of juju, which itself is a subset of a much, much bigger set of practices known as African witchcraft. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because human trafficking or slavery is a crime against human rights. Slavery is specifically prohibited under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, it's specifically prohibited very early on. The 4th article on the UN Declaration of Human Rights bans slavery. It matters too because cultural beliefs are being used to facilitate this terrible crime. And it matters because juju has been used in Ireland to commit acts of human trafficking, acts of slavery. But equally, it matters abroad because juju is also used to commit acts of human trafficking in other jurisdictions too. The victims, as they often are in cases of human trafficking, not always, but often, but the victims very much in this particular instance tend to be women and girls, and they can come from both the Christian and from the Muslim faiths. What we're talking about here is not an obscurity. It's a major organized crime, so a major criminal enterprise. Involves a series of people working in tandem. Usually can break these roles up into about 4 different ones. So the recruiters exist at the initial stage. Often these recruiters are women. Then you have the juju priests who deliver the rites. And then you have intermediaries who exist in the countries between the destination and the source, and they're sometimes known as trolleys. And then finally, you'll have the pimps and madams who are coercing victims. In this case, what we're looking at is very much a transnational crime. So it's a crime across borders. But, you know, again, just to caution that human trafficking, slavery, doesn't require actually any movement at all. So a person can be trafficked and they needn't move not 1 inch. Again, a person can be made available to be exploited without them ever moving at all. But in this case, we're talking about transnational crime. So I'm not sure this slide is quite rendering properly. Some of the text, I think, has kind of gone behind, so my apologies for that. But we're going to look here on this slide about where this exploitation happens, and this is significant. Okay, so it really is. It's these 2 places I'm going to mention. So if we think of continental Africa, and I'm not going to assume people know where Nigeria necessarily is, if we think of continental Africa, there's obviously a part that goes north-south, and then it stems off to the west. So there's kind of an underbelly to Africa where Africa protrudes into the west. And on that underbelly is the great state of Nigeria. And it's a huge place. I mean, it's about the population of Nigeria is about 24 times the size of Ireland. So it's about 120 million people living in Nigeria. And on the southern part of Nigeria, there are 2 states, and you can see them marked here, Edo, which is on the left, and the other one, which is the Delta state. And really, what we're talking about here tonight really affects these 2. These 2 are the acknowledged places where this happens. The combined population of these, in this kind of seeming small corner, is actually 10 million people. So it's again quite a significant place, you know, twice the population. we have here in Ireland. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just move on into the second section, where we're going to look at more specifics. So rather than we've given you kind of the overview, we're going to look now kind of at the more detailed view of what actually happens. So what I'm going to do in this section is I'm going to outline a typical case of what happens to a person. So I'm going to outline what we call the rights that they endure as part of the process and the process itself. And I would ask you to bear in mind that 90%, and these figures come from Nigeria itself, 90% of girls trafficked from Nigeria undergo what I'm about to describe here. And I'm not talking about females, I'm talking about juvenile girls. Do we have all of the picture of what happens? Well, I suppose like any criminal enterprise and looking into a criminal enterprise, the answer is probably not, but we have an awful lot of it. Does it happen precisely this way every time? Probably not. But again, what I'm going to say is reflective of the most of it. The story tends to be graphic of what happens to people. I'm not going to dwell on graphic parts. I do have to mention certain elements, but I'm not going to go into detail. So I'm going to start by telling you Joy's story. So Joy lives in Edo, a state in southern Nigeria, and Joy dreams of a life abroad. And Joy, like all her neighbours, knows how people in the West have great lives. They don't have any problems. Life in the West is so easy. They're all rich and well off, but Joy doesn't have that life. So one day, Joy is approached by a friend of her cousin's. And this lady's name is Promise. And Promise tells Joy about a job in a place called Ireland. Now, Joy has never heard of Ireland. Promise tells her all about it. She tells her about how there's a job in a shop, and this job involves the cutting of hair. And the job pays about 60,000 euros every year. So Joy is absolutely thrilled. It's a dream come true. She often cuts hair for her family members, for her good friends, and for her neighbors. So she knows this is a job she can do. Now, there are a few challenges here because Joy doesn't have any money, and she doesn't have a passport either. So Promise tells her that it's going to cost about 30,000 euros to take her over to Ireland. It's going to be a considerable outlay. And this is money that's just simply beyond Joy's capacity to pay. But Promise, as an answer to all of this, she's going to pay the full expense, and she's going to help too in arranging the passports. But this is not free by any means. Promise wants the money paid back in due course. So Joy is very happy again with all of this. The road ahead is clear. A new life beckons. And importantly too, because she's from where she's from, there's a status element about having someone abroad. So it's really, really important. Those families that have someone abroad working in Europe, that's seen as, you're doing really well in life. So at this stage, she has actually committed a bit of a difficulty for herself, because in promising to work against a debt, Joy now finds herself in a situation of bonded labor. It's actually illegal. So she's already taken unknowingly the first steps into a life of slavery. Now, Promise goes away and she makes all these arrangements. So she arranges for Joy to get a passport, and that's cleared. And then one day, and a little while later on, Promise mentions to her, look, I know we've arranged for this 30,000 to be paid, but I want some assurance of this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to go to the local juju priest and swear an oath that you're going to pay me back in full. Now, Joy is a bit reticent about this. She understands the seriousness of oaths, and particularly juju oaths. These are not to be trifled with. But eventually she decides, well, look, she trusts promise, so she's going to go and do just that. And anyway, she fully intends to repay all of the money. So why shouldn't she pay or make this oath? So she proceeds then to a shrine. Now, in our case, the shrine I'm going to describe is going to be a physical building with maybe a courtyard and a kind of a building inside. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. The understanding from West Africa is it might also be a spiritual place. It might be a place beside a river, for example. You know, those quiet places that we've all observed in life that seem those particularly spiritual place of significance. So that might be a place where this could happen as well. So at the shrine, she encounters the juju priest. And the juju priest starts the process of making the oath. Now, one of the things that Joy is made to do is disrobe, so she's naked. A chicken is killed, and she probably has to consume some part of that raw chicken. Hair will be cut from her body. Her nails may be cut. Blades are taken, and her body is nicked in places by razor blades. A concoction might be made, which she is required to consume. She's compelled to lie down in a coffin, or maybe even to sleep in the coffin. And incantations are recited then by the priest as well.
And in the back, okay.
So at the end of this process, Joy is left deeply traumatized. So, obviously she's been through a terrible physical experience. She's also been through a terrible psychological and spiritual one as well. Now, promise returns, okay, so the passport is already in place, everything is in place, and Joy is sent off to, so we're going to say Italy in this case, where she arrives, and she's met by a man, and he's quite pleasant to her. He brings her to a place where she spends a few days. They probably don't go out a lot, but she's quite happy. He's very polite to her. They eat well, they talk. She gets to know him a little bit. And then after a few days, she's given a new passport. And this isn't her passport at all. This is a passport that belongs to a person who looks just like her. And she's able to use this passport then to get into her destination country. So in this case, we're going to say Ireland. So she arrives then in Ireland. And bear in mind now, so the guy who was in Italy, he's gone now. He's out of the scene. Promise, she's out of the scene as well. She's gone. She's back at home. So Joy now has arrived in Ireland. And the people that she meets, again, they're quite pleasant for an initial while. Everything seems fine. There's all the excitement. The job is there. It's all lined up. It's all going to happen. But then characteristically, without fail, there's what I call the switch. And the switch to me is where everything is twisted. There's this moment where everything now comes together, and there's a moment of utter betrayal, and where the real motives come. And reading through, I think many stories over years, you always see this. It's real telltale sign. So what happens is there's no job. The job is gone, but for all the inability of the people who are supposed to provide the job, to provide that job, they're still going to hold Joy to her end of the bargain. So now she's indebted 30,000 euros. She has sworn an oath, the worst of all oaths, which is the juju oath. All money has to be repaid, and she needs to repay it. And her destination will be prostitution. And that's the reality of how this works. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave a short reflection for us here, just to look at some of the words, the things I mentioned. Some of the things now appear maybe later on in our talk, but the kind of things that a person would mention themselves if they're recounting their story about what would happen, what has happened to them, what you'd expect to hear from them. So what does Joy understand are the primary effects of her oath? There are primary and there are secondary effects. I'm just going to focus for the purpose of this slide and this talk on the primary effects. There are two primary effects that Joy understands. One of these is definitely confidentiality, that she's bound to not speak about the arrangements that have been made, about what has happened back at home, that she's sworn an oath. There's nothing like that. She's not going to admit to that. So confidentiality, the identities of people involved, that's really, really important. That'd be a violation of one's oath. And then obviously the one that we've mentioned already is that she's going to pay back her debt. Interestingly, I always think that really paying back the debt is the weaponization too of her own integrity. So her own honesty is being used against her. And it's copper fastened by this oath that she has sworn, the identity of her people. And there are consequences. There are serious consequences to violating one's oath, so much so that most won't even contemplate it. And what's believed is that the swearer, in this case Joy, that if she violates her oath, she could well die. She would believe that certainly a relative could well die too. She might go insane. She might have perpetual bad luck. Sometimes if someone mentioned to me the word calamity, and I think it's this perpetual thing. It isn't just a one-off thing, but everything in your life turns into this series of events that are bad luck. She might experience infertility, and then horrifically that she might actually die as well in delivering a child. I mentioned earlier how I'd used the works of people who had written about slavery prior to the US Civil War. And one of those people was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she really summed up the slavery of her time as the essence of all abuse. And I think you can get an idea from what I've just recounted why Harriet Beecher Stowe would say that. The way people are treated, that they're reduced to their bodies, deprived of themselves, and just effectively a thing. We are approaching now toward just nearing our conclusions. I'm just going to add one or two more things. In 2011, the King of Benin, now this Benin is a city in Edo. It's not the Benin that's to the west of Nigeria. There's a king there, and as a king, he's known as the Oba, and his name is Eware II. And he's seen as a man who's powerful in his own way, but his power confers on him various different aspects. And one of the things that he did in 2011 was he invalidated oaths, and he put a curse himself on the traffickers. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot to be seen what the effect of this would be. It is felt that his power is limited, so not everyone would necessarily accept his proclamation. And it was also felt that the traffickers might be motivated to move on to other territories if they felt their tactics were no longer working. So the effect of it still remains to be seen, and maybe one of our speakers later on might have more on that. So just in section 3 now, or just as I approach our conclusions, I think it's natural to ask on reflection well, is this real? Is all of this real? I think that's a natural question. Well, we can say that juju is certainly a cultural belief in West Africa. We can also say that Nigeria's authorities try to stop oaths being taken. And those authorities are the very people who are tasked in Nigeria with combating human trafficking from that area. Human traffickers definitely use these oaths. Pimps and madams also remind victims who have taken these oaths of the fact that they have taken them. And the King of Benin has had to intervene himself in all of this to try and put an end to it. So is it real? Well, unfortunately, yes, it is real. Are there other intersections? Well, there are places that one could look to for the intersections. In the Americas, for example, in Southern America and the Caribbean area, you could look at the cult of Santa Muerta, which is this kind of Grim Reaper type character. It's not a even though it's saint death is what the translation is, but death isn't actually a saint at all. So there are probably other intersections that have been documented. This one actually, Santa Muerta, has been documented in FBI bulletins. There are other intersections with other forms of African witchcraft where people are used in a different way. And there probably are other intersections of where culture has been used, weaponized in effect, in the context of human trafficking. Just for the purpose of other reading, if you want to look at other sources of information as well on this, there's Open Secrets, a book that we wrote with some years ago when I was with Cushchina. So that was a work by Father Angelo Lafferty, by Jerry Ford, by Dr. Jane Dewan, now in the United States, and she's an anthropologist, and myself. There is a case there. The second one is a case from the journal.ie involving conviction here in this country for human trafficking that involved exactly what I've laid out here this evening. There's a wonderful, albeit very, very dark report from EC Pat France, and the link is given to that there. And that goes into much more detail. And there's also a YouTube video from Al Jazeera, which covers this quite extensively as well. And that'll give you more of a kind of a visual element of, you know, the place, the people, and what goes on. I do want to say, just make one offer as well, that, you know, I do have some ebooks that I can make available, copies of my book for free to anyone who is interested. You can avail of it through the link that's on the slide, or you can scan there, and I will endeavor to send you a free copy. It's yours to keep forever via Apple Books. And that's really it. I hope you have enjoyed my part, certainly, of what I've contributed here. And if you have any questions, as was mentioned earlier, please do post them because all questions are certainly most welcome. And I'm just going to pass over to my colleague now for this evening, Ijora.
And before Ejiro begins, I would like to introduce her.
Jerry, you're muted.
Apologies. I'd like to introduce Ejiro Ogbeboin. She is a Dublin-based counselling psychotherapist and clinical advisor. She's the founder of Black Therapists Ireland, an organisation that actively promotes mental health and well-being among Black people living in Ireland. And in addition to her private practice, Ejiro lectures at the Dublin City University and PCI College. So over to you, Ejiro.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jared. Well done, David. That was very expressive and intense look at the human trafficking that's happening around the world, but in this case, specifically Nigeria, Edo State. So you mentioned two areas. I am from Delta State and I'm married to an Edo man. So I kind of have an idea of some of these happenings in the area. You asked the question, is this real? It is real. It is sad and shocking that these things happen, but one thing I want to say is the desperation that people feel is real. The desperation and the helplessness and hopelessness in the country and in the economy is making people susceptible to such happenings. The idea that, you know, a better life is outside Nigeria is so potent that people will do almost anything to leave. I love that you mentioned that switch where people get to whatever country they have been moved to, expecting to do good work and pay back the money that they have indebted at this point. But those scenarios do happen, but there are scenarios where people are quite aware of what they may be getting into. They are quite aware of the prostitution and some of these things that they believe back home that this is the only way out. And some people actually voluntarily put themselves in this situation. However, many do not understand at all the impact of what they will actually be going through. That is what shocks and really traumatizes a lot of people. It sounds, like you explained, it sounds straightforward, it sounds easy, it sounds doable, but at the end of the day, it's not. And your sense of self, you're stripped to nothing to be able to pay back the money that has been invested in you. And the oaths, those are, yeah, real, based on fear as well. People take these things seriously. A piece of red cloth could be just a piece of red cloth, but back home, it is so significant, especially in the Edo area, where if you see a piece of red cloth, you know something is amiss, and the fear that goes through you is real. So it's this beliefs, things that we have heard and seen, causes us to stay away from certain things. And if you put yourself through an oath, it is binding to a large extent. Your beliefs, it's real. It holds you. There's a grip on you that you have to fulfill. It may not make logical sense. It may seem, you should understand, but that's not what's happening. These beliefs really it's encompassing. So there have been instances, yes, that people get caught in these situations. And unfortunately, it is a crime. It is, people are benefiting from this. And when we talk about how do we end this, I think we need to look at the whole spectrum of where these people land, people that are involved, and at each point find ways to interject all of this. And then if people are found, like the girls, making them criminals for being in these countries, it's just an additional burden to everything that they have been going through. And that is what most countries will see, that they are not supposed to be here, they're illegal, all them things, which is true to a large extent. But how can we support the victims so they're not criminalized for something that, they had no complete awareness of, or the information they had was limited. So how do we support that system? I suppose at this point I can just say what has been happening is true, and the oath from the Oba is something that has really reduced it in the Edo area. The Obas, my husband was talking, because I had a conversation with him around this, that in recent years, since the oath, a lot of people have taken it upon themselves to respect the Oba's declaration. And a lot of priests, juju priests as well, are afraid of death based on what the Oba has said. And so there has been a reduction, significant reduction in people taking these oaths and people traveling for trafficking and all them things. But like you stated, it has moved on to other areas, because the Oba can only take care of his clan and his area, which will be Edo. He has no jurisdiction over other communities. So other parts of the world and the country, things are happening, and it's difficult for the trafficking to be managed. So yeah, I think we need more to look at this that is happening in Nigeria. I want to say, though, that the fear in the country is real, and people are capitalizing on people's fear and desperation. And there's nothing, like, it's easy for us to try to curb the human trafficking, but there's another aspect to it. The helplessness and hopelessness in the country is causing this to be a reality for so many people as a means to survive. And even the people that are trafficking, at the end of the day, they're trying to make money and survive. Unfortunately, it's at the expense of people's lives. So that is what I want to say at the moment. And I'm open to answering any questions to see what else I can offer that would help people understand the situation and hopefully find ways that we can support victims and change the system that's killing a lot of people. Thank you. I will just pass this over to Jer.
Thank you. Thank you, Ejiro. It's so valuable to have a Nigerian voice speaking to this. We appreciate it very much. Also like to remind all the participants that anybody who registered for this will receive the recording. And I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box. Thank you.
Hi, and we do have some questions in the chat box, which I will pass on now. So please, as I said, continue if you have some more. One of the first questions we got was, what evidence is there of juju being used in Ireland to commit this crime? And I suppose there's a connecting question then. Is it possible that juju rights are being used outside of Nigeria for human trafficking? David.
So yes, so there was conviction in Mullingar, of all places. Not that it matters to where it happens, but certainly there was a conviction some months back, and probably a little bit longer ago, so where two people were convicted, and very much what was in the public arena was this information that these rights had been used. So there certainly is evidence. I would point to the fact, significance that the fact that Cushchina itself, did all this work years ago, which predates by many years, what happened in Mullingar. So at that stage, there were signs available for all those who, were interested in looking. So the book itself was produced in, I think it was 2012 that we did Open Secrets, but the conviction itself happened many years after that. So I think, yes, certainly there is evidence. It's just, this is what I'm talking about may seem, a little bit kind of on the extraordinary front, but in some ways it's not really extraordinary to the issue of human trafficking at all. It's just another characteristic of what happens, in relation to a particular element of human trafficking.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, the idea, that confidentiality that you mentioned really keeps this quiet and buried in a lot of ways. And people are afraid to speak for fear of their own death or the death of their relatives. So before it goes to that point where we're seeing the evidence, things are happening, definitely happening. I personally have seen some stuff around that nobody would notice that this is something that has been used for a ritual, for example. I have seen it in city center. I have seen it in parks. Like an average person would not notice that this pot or this thing it has been used for ritual, but it is around. It's just, how would you know? How do you catch? Like, it's not against the law to practice your beliefs, but how is it being used to promote the crime that is going on? It is happening.
And that's one of the challenges too, that some of these things get kind of taken, with a partial picture. They seem like, well, just, they're kind of harmless things almost. But until you have the full picture, and then you realize, well, actually, there is much more to the story. So it isn't just about the juju, it's about the intersection of the juju and the human trafficking, the reality. Yes. And I think it's like that. You have to have the full picture if you're really going to understand what's going on.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question is, what is being done to address the psychological grip on victims here in Ireland? Ejiro.
And that is a really difficult one. To be honest with you, until I came to this conversation with Sister Eilish, human trafficking hasn't really been on my radar, to be honest, because there's so much going on. And I started the organization Black Therapists Ireland. The idea is to bring Black therapists together to make it easy for people to find us. That it was a difficult thing in Ireland. So I don't know if these victims are being actively supported psychologically. A lot of it's being viewed through criminal lenses as opposed to offering psychological support. So I can't speak too much of it. It hasn't come my way where we're being asked to support people, victims. So I can't speak to how much is happening in Ireland. I really hope that more, I definitely think more could be done, because I would have been involved, I think, but I'm not. So I don't know. I don't know if you know anything, David.
A little bit. I suppose just in general, what I would know is that I suppose it isn't, I suppose counseling works to a degree, but I think really that the difficulty always is that, people are very faithful to these beliefs, and it is very, very difficult. So I don't see it as just something that someone's going to go for counseling and work their way through it. So yeah, and I was a very interesting talk some months ago in Dublin, and I thought it was most interesting, just an insight from that I obtained from the day, was how psychological trauma can actually change the brain. So it can have a physical effect, and that wasn't something I didn't know before, but I could understand how someone who has gone through these processes could end up again with real damage to the brain just purely from the trauma they've endured, and those things aren't easily moved beyond.
Yeah. I would totally agree with that. The trauma they have gone through has changed and continued to impact their lives. So definitely some kind of psychological support would be beneficial. It may not solve the problem, but we need to buffer the victims with not just the justice and the criminal lenses. Then we need to take a look at the psychological impact, because some of these women are having kids and attempting to live life. So things are happening that further deepening hurt and injury in so many lives.
I suppose a natural question following that from that has come in as well. Are there organisations, church or rights groups in Ireland that help victims to gain freedom, to get real paying jobs, or to go back home? Is there that level of support?
I don't know about going, well, IOM is an organization that works with migrants. Spirasi work with people who have gone through torture. But I don't know about coming out of the system, because the problem with coming out of the system is you still owe 30,000 grants. Like somebody has to pay that money. So even if you do get the support psychologically, even if you do get all this, you're still indebted to somebody. And your life and the life of your family is still at stake. So how do we come out of that cycle? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a comment come in from someone as well, from Donald Dower, that Spirasi in Dublin specialises in helping migrants traumatised by torture. And he says, do we not now need a specialised service for people traumatised by this weaponisation of juju?
Well, do we need a special? I don't know if we need a special. Where are the victims to start with? I don't know if they are. I don't know about David. Are we seeing these people? Are people coming out to say, they need help, they need support, because how do we support people that would not come for help?
And I just do see a comment there from a great advocate and friend, Mia DeFricha of Ruhama in Dublin. And again, that's an organisation as well, among others, who help people. And I know Ruhama will have seen this and offer a lot of support to people. So if there are people who need that support, certainly there are some great organisations that I know of, certainly in Dublin. I won't name names because there's quite a few of them, and they all help in different capacities. Helping people with understanding, and each brings their own strength to the situation to try and help people deal with this thing. I suppose the reality of all these problems too, of course, is that once one creates a problem, the problems tend to be multifaceted. So there's never just the one element. There's a whole pile of complexity around trying to support people who are in situations like this. And I know those organizations in Dublin, certainly I couldn't speak highly enough of them.
Okay, and I'm having a bit of difficulty navigating the chat here on my computer, but we just got another question. What can the Irish citizen do at a local and national levels? Do we have sufficient legislation and government policies nationally and internationally to try and stop this?
Yeah, so we certainly have legislation, and I know the guards, to be fair, do take actions. One of the things that were done some years ago was there was great advocacy in Ireland for this Nordic or Swiss model or Swedish model. There's various different names, the equality model, and really, I suppose an awareness too about the reality of the power of a buyer. I mean, fundamentally, all of these things come down to money, and what motivates all of this, unfortunately, is just money. It's a crime, an economic crime, and those that go out and buy sexual services, this is the consequence of it. And people can go out and do that, but there are other people who are paying for with their lives, essentially, with their minds, with their bodies, with their spirits. They're paying for that decision to, so really, I suppose money talks. And really, people need to be aware of what goes on, the harsh reality of human trafficking, in the sex trade and in other places too. The sex trade accounts for a lot of it. It doesn't account for all of it, but all of us buy different things in life. And one has to ask, well, where does our money go?
There's some other comments and information that's come in here. There's mention of Ruhama a few times. I like one thing to say, Ruhama supported 497 people in 2023, and many of those were from Nigeria. So there are support services available to people. There's loads of other comments, and most of them are thanking you for your presentation. So I think we'll move on now, and I'm going to hand you over to Brian O'Toole, who will try to bring much of what we've heard here tonight together. Brian is the Justice Officer for the Presentation Sisters, and he wears many other hats. He is the chair of AEFJN, and he is also a member and involved very much in APT Ireland as well. So over to you, Brian.
Jerry, thanks very much indeed. And I have to say a huge thanks to David and to Rogero for their very insightful presentations this evening, albeit quite disturbing, I have to say, but very, very enlightening. It's not an accident, I think, that this particular webinar happens at this time of the year. Tonight is just a few days after the feast day of Saint Paquita, and it's really to commemorate that particular day that this webinar has been held this evening. I'm reminded of Pope Francis' homily on the 8th of February, where he said, "It is a sin against the dignity of a person and their fundamental rights to reduce them by violence to the productive value or to a source of profit. Human trafficking is a crime against humanity." And that's the one message that keeps coming through very, very clearly this evening. It is never, never too late to take action. Another message that comes through. And I think it's a question that Irene Byrne asked her, that Jerry mentioned from Irene, that what can the citizen do? We must, I think, believe, as Pope Francis says, that the fight against human trafficking can be won. and that everybody can believe that it also can be. If we are to close our eyes and our ears, and if we do nothing, then we are guilty by complicity. These were the words of Pope Francis in his most recent homily on the 8th of February. David told us that juju is being used in Ireland to ensnare, to control, to trick, to manipulate victims of human trafficking. He explained very clearly that cultural beliefs are used effectively to exploit and to threaten, and that in many cases, the victims are girls and women. He told us of the organization and the machine behind those who traffic. He spoke of recruiters, of juju priests, of pimps and trolls, and that typically 90% of girls trafficked undergo these rites. I was particularly struck by Joy's story. David told it so well, he told it so clearly. I tried to think of my own niece or somebody I know in those shoes. And then when I put that in the context of when Ejiro spoke of the desperation and the hopelessness and almost the dream of young girls to leave their country, when you match the two together, you can see a perfect storm whereby preying on the vulnerability and the needs of young girls, you have people who will come in and try and manipulate them into situations, and everything goes fine until that word that David mentioned, the switch. The fear that people speak of, or the worry that some of the victims have in terms of what they may feel if they break their oath. It's a case that maybe that they might die in childbirth, or that maybe a relative will die, or that bad luck will follow them, or maybe insanity or infertility, or many more things may befall them. And that the real role of these and the value of those who try and break these oaths. David, like many of us, asks us, what can be done to end it? When Ejiro spoke, she spoke and she reminded us very clearly of examples of what David was speaking about. So she was able to back up a lot of David's work with testimony from where she lives. She spoke of preying on fear. She told us that it was real. David told us it was real. And then Ejiro came back in and assured us it was real. But not only is it real, but that it is shocking, that there is a real desperation, that there is a hopelessness. And within this, you can recognize the real push factors that will organize or push people into situations of being trafficked. Sadly, Ejiro also reminded us that some girls volunteered themselves into this, not knowing the ramifications of the decision that they are making, but they volunteer themselves perhaps for a change or a better life than they feel they have at the moment. Again, Ejiro was taken by the importance of the word switch that David used. The grip of the cultural belief overrides common sense. It overrides any practical response. Ejiro also reminded us of what we might know as the non-punishment principle, the NPP, whereby victims of human trafficking are criminalized. So not only are they victims of being trafficked, but then they are further victimized by becoming criminalized for work that they might be asked to do by the traffickers. So when they have no choice, so by in their exploitation, that they are being asked to do some work that they are being criminalized. And we know that this is also a case in Ireland, that people have been criminalized and put in jail in Ireland, even though the work that they have been involved in, or the criminality that they have been involved in, has been at the behest of those that are exploited. Sister Justina, who sent in a few thoughts before she came in tonight, she also referenced the point that in countries like Nigeria, there is often a certain corruption that is there, and that this corruption can allow for a collusion that often allows the traffickers to work with a greater degree of impunity than might be the case in other countries. She spoke of teenagers encouraged by their families, as Ejiro had said to leave, knowing that they are being trafficked, but out of a desperation for money. In responding to this evening's webinar, I took some time to go through the recently launched third National Action Plan on Human Trafficking, which was launched last year by Minister McEntee in November. And I deliberately went looking for the inclusion of culture and beliefs to try and find what David and Ajiro have been talking about, to see it as referenced in the third National Action Plan. It isn't actually specifically referenced. More broadly, perhaps in the form of threats and that, but it isn't specifically. And I'm wondering, perhaps, is this a point that might be taken up? Because I do know that this third National Action Plan is a huge step forward in terms of where we are now, in terms of in the context of where we have been. And it also is very promising in terms of what we expected. But there wasn't a mention of this particular cultural belief. While the action plan is good, we do await the detail of what we hope will be a proactive national referral mechanism. And by proactive, I mean that it searches out for victims of human trafficking. And when it finds victims of human trafficking, it comes armed with a range of services and supports that will thwart the trafficker and bring him or her before the courts and prosecute them to the full extent of the law. This is the least that the victim of trafficking can expect. Second only to drugs in terms of profit, a person is used again and again, and human trafficking is an extremely profitable crime. And it was one of the last points made that money is often the driver behind a lot of this. And each time a victim is trafficked, this is an assault on their dignity. Pope Francis is correct when he said, we have to believe that the battle against human trafficking can be won. But he also asserts that we can only overcome such an insidious crime against the person if we work together. And our webinar tonight is an example of that. If we go back to Irene Byrne's question that Jerry posed, what can the citizen do? So this is your challenge this evening. Eilish told you during the meeting that this webinar is going to be shared. David has offered you a link to his book for free. The resources that David has prepared this evening will be sent out, along with the links that David referenced on the end of his presentation to the case in Mullingar, to the French study, to the YouTube clip. All of this will be available afterwards, which is fantastic. But the question to you tonight is, how are you going to use it? What are you going to do? I'm asking you, and we're asking you, if you would take this and talk about it, share it with somebody else, so pass on the recording when you get it. Because as I said, this is the least that a victim deserves. Otherwise, how will anyone ever learn to recognize this trauma, as David puts it, of human trafficking that is happening in plain sight? And then to borrow my final sentence from David's presentation, slavery is the essence of all abuse. So once again, thank you, David. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Eilish. And thank you, Jerry Ford and Michelle, and to the OLA and SMA who put this webinar together to commemorate on the feast day of St. Pete. Thanks again.
And with all those thanks, we thank Brian for that, those wise words of wisdom. And we appreciate all of your presence here this evening. I think it's been a wonderful occasion where we've been able to learn a lot from David, from Ajiro's feedback on it. And certainly myself as Justice Officer with the OLA and working closely with SMA Fathers, it's been very enlightening. I was struck on my way here by a thought when I passed by a hotel here in Cork where the famous slave liberator Frederick Douglass stayed in 1845. He visited here in Ireland from America during those famine years. And he was a close friend of our great liberator, Daniel O'Connell. It shows really that there's a link between the hope that Ireland offered him then and a link between the hope that civil society can offer those victims of trafficking and modern day slavery these days. We've had recent legislation put together to assist with modernising laws and how to help those that are trafficked in modern Ireland and across the world, from across the world. And of course, here in Ireland's second city, one of our neighbouring counties on the 8th of January had a terrible news story of 14 victims of trafficking in the port that were discovered in Rosslare that became a national news story. So those two incidences of history and the present show that this concept of modern day slavery, trafficking, and that worrying culture is still very much literally on our doorstep and needs to be addressed.
So thank you tonight to David, to Ejiro, to Brian, and mostly also to yourselves for tuning in. We would encourage you to accept the links from David and enjoy the links from him, from his good work, from his book, from his website. There are much work online about the great activities and the knowledge that he has accumulated over the years. And also, please keep in touch with the activities that we are involved in at the OLA Sisters and the SMA Fathers through our website, olaireland.ie and sma.ie. We have communications channels that are very active on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram and on Twitter to let you know what we're up to in keeping faith alive and hope alive. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening and keep in touch.